Hello everybody, this is Mr. Lucas once again with another virtual lesson. Today in class we talked about demobilization, how America was impacted socially, economically, logistically with the ending of a war on the home front. Today what we're going to be talking about is America's foreign policy. Now if we were in class we would be doing this quick write. What I'd like for you to do is just think about this quick write. Imagine you were with a group of friends and you had to decide to hold a party and things get broken. When it's time to pay for the damages, how do you calculate who owes what? And how do you ensure the person whose item was broken actually gets back what they lost? So take a moment, think about that. You don't need to answer it, but how would you kind of divvy up who is responsible and who's responsible for what? All right, today's spotlight vocab word is reparations. Even though America did not sign the Treaty of Versailles, our allies and Germany did after World War I. One of the biggest contentions inside this treaty was the idea of reparations, which is money that would have to be paid back for the injustice. This obviously is not something that's going to make Germany very happy. America, despite wanting to be isolationist in regard to treaties, would come to play a role in the reparations payments of Germany, which we'll cover shortly. Before we cover that answer, I'd like to talk about reparations in regard to like the spotlight vocab. So World War I damages, things that were damaged during World War I would be the farmlands that existed in Europe, merchant ships, which is like a civilian vessel, towns and villages were both destroyed. There were countless numbers of civilian deaths and injuries, and it destroyed infrastructure through many different countries, so like factories, railways, bridges. If this word could talk, what do you think it would say about World War I? For me, I think it would say, after all that fighting, the destruction was immense. Imagine, farmlands ruined, ships at the bottom of the ocean, towns demolished, and lives shattered. Germany, you were largely blamed, and it was decided that you had to pay up. Even though Germany didn't feel like this was primarily their fault, they do end up, from a global standpoint, facing all the punishment of World War I. Now, if we were doing this in class, I would jigsaw out the 4 different secondary sources that you see on the screen to one person at each group. Obviously, we're not really able to do that, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to read over all of them, I'm going to talk about all of them, and then I'm going to answer what would be questions that you would be answering on your papers. So you better understand each one of these different policies that guided how America interacted with other countries throughout the war at the time. So the first plan that we're going to be talking about is the Dawes Plan. In late 1923, with European powers stalemated over German reparations, the Reparation Commission formed a committee to review the situation. Headed by a man named Charles G. Dawes, the committee represented its proposal in April of 1924. Under the Dawes Plan, Germany's annual reparation payments would be reduced, increasing over time as its economy improved. The full amount to be paid, however, was left undetermined. Foreign banks would loan German government $200 million to help encourage economic stabilization. Now, if we look at this diagram, it says the United States, U.S., would lend $2 billion to Germany to build back up its economy. Germany would then pay $2 billion in reparations to the Allied powers, UK and France. UK and France would then spend $2.6 billion in war debts that they originally owed the United States. So we're going in this very cyclical, paying of money, but no one's ever actually ending up with the money in a foolproof way. Over the next 4 years, U.S. banks continued to lend money to Germany, enough money to enable it to meet its reparation payments to countries such as France and the United Kingdom, These countries in turn used their reparation payments from Germany to service their war debts to the United States in 1925. Dawes was a co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition for his plans contribution to the resolution of the crisis of reparations. So the question asks, Germany was expected to pay reparations because, but, and so. So for me, I would say Germany was expected to pay reparations because it was held responsible for the World War I damages. Although Germany did not feel like this was fair, they were blamed, and by signing the Treaty of Versailles, they accepted that blame. The next question. Germany was expected to pay reparations, but the initial demands were too high, leading to economic problems. And then finally, Germany was expected to pay reparations, so the Dawes Plan was created to make payments manageable and stabilize the economy. The next foreign policy we're going to be discussing is the Fordney-McCumber tariff. Okay, President Harding, the new president of America, asked Congress for an emergency tariff legislation stating, I believe in the protection of American industry, and it is our purpose to prosper America first. Soon after, Congress had enacted the Fordney-McCumber Act, which was among the most harsh protectionist tariffs passed in the country's history, raising the average import tax some 40%. It was initiated by Representative J. Fordney and Senator P. McCumber. So how did tariffs work? A hat made in the United States might cost $3. A hat made in Europe may also cost $3. This is a competitive situation. However, as an American government official, we would prefer that Americans are buying American products. So what does a tariff do? A tariff places $1 and an added price to the hats made in Europe. So now, as a result, if you were a consumer trying to get your hat from Europe, you have to pay an extra $1. This U.S. product is now less expensive as a result. Some people are very uninterested in tariffs because it kind of takes away like the consumer's choice. It kind of forces you to choose an American product. However, this is good when our economy is bad and we need to boost American-made industry. Throughout the 1920s, however, as European farmers recovered from World War I and their American counterparts faced intense competitions and declining prices because of overproduction, U.S. agriculture interests lobbied the federal government for protection against agricultural imports. So, our farming industry is asking our government to actively increase tariffs on crops being grown in other countries because they're hurting. They're hurting because at one point in time they had to grow so many produce that was being sent overseas, and now that the war is no longer happening, the demand just isn't there. So, same as what we did for the Dawes Plan. The Fordney-McCumber tariff was enacted because President Harding wanted to protect the American industry. The Fordney-McCumber tariff was enacted, but it ultimately led to U.S. farmers facing intense competition and declining prices due to overproduction. And then finally, the Fordney-McCumber tariff was enacted, so it significantly raised import taxes, making it one of the toughest protectionist tariffs, trying to protect American industry. We're going to skip those questions. There were Americans who expressed their concern for economic and political outcomes of the Treaty of Versailles. Among them was the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. This organization was critical of the treaty, and it gave this statement at the 1919 Zurich Conference. This International Congress of Women expresses its deep regret that the terms of peace proposed at Versailles should so seriously violate the principles upon which alone a just and lasting peace can be secured. The terms of peace create all over Europe discords and animosities which can only lead to future wars. We will now shift our conversation from economic policies, which we saw with the Dawes Plan and the Fordney-McCumber tariff, to political agreements. In the picture from the conference that I just mentioned, you're going to see women whom you might be familiar with. Jeannette Rankin is the first woman to have ever held political office in the United States. She was the first elected woman to the United States House of Representatives. Next, there's Mary Church Terrell, one of the first African American women to earn a college degree and became known as a national activist for the civil rights and suffrage movements. And then Jane Addams, who is a social worker, peace activist, and a leader of the settlement house movement in America. Continuing on, talking about political foreign policy. Because the language established that only wars of aggression, not military acts of self-defense, would be covered under the pact, many nations had no objections to signing it. If the pact limited conflicts, then everyone would benefit. If it did not, there were no legal consequences for acts of self-defense. The pact was eventually signed by most established nations in the world. And I apologize, that's the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Oh, and I actually did skip a slide. All right, a peace pact was proposed between the United States and France to outlaw war between them. Secretary of State Kellogg of the United States worried the agreement would be interpreted as an alliance. To avoid this, he suggested they invite all nations to join them in outlawing war. It read, "The renunciation of war as an instrument of national policy should be made to end that the peace and friendly relations now existing between their peoples may be perpetuated." Then we go to this slide. I'm sorry, guys. So with the Kellogg-Briand Pact, it was agreed to because it invited all nations to outlaw aggressive war, not self-defense, and making it widely acceptable. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was agreed to, but it lacked legal consequences for self-defense, limiting its overall power to prevent conflicts. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was agreed to, so most established nations signed it, aiming to promote peaceful relations globally. Armaments, which I mentioned that word before. If you recall back to some of the causes of World War I, militarism was one of the main driving factors for the First World War. In order to better prepare the world for peace, many countries, including the United States, began to focus on reducing their armaments in unison with other countries. Armaments are a military's weapons and equipment. With this in mind, attempting to unscramble the sentence. No, we're not going to do that. We're not going to unscramble the sentence. Just know that armaments are America and other countries' weapon buildup, and over a period of time, they try to reduce those. Okay, the Washington Naval Conference. After World War I, leaders in the international community wanted to prevent the possibility of another war. In 1921, the United States Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, invited 9 nations to Washington, D.C. to discuss naval reductions. And this situation is depicted the situation in the Far East. Sorry. This idea is depicted on the right. The 5-Power Treaty called for each of the countries involved to maintain a ratio of warship tonnage. The conference ultimately adopted a 5-5-3 ratio. In the 4-Power Treaty, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom and Japan agreed to consult with each other in the event of future crisis in East Asia before taking action. The 9-Power Treaty marked the internationalization of the United States open door policy with China. So, the Washington Naval Conference, occurred because leaders wanted to prevent another world war. The Washington Naval Conference occurred, but it didn't prevent future conflicts because we know World War II ended up occurring. And then the final one, the Washington Naval Conference occurred, so 3 major treaties emerged: the 5-Power, the 4-Power, and 9-Power treaties, aiming to limit naval arms and address East Asian stability. Those are all the questions I have for you for this unit. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry if this video was long. Please do your best to answer all the questions on the Ed Puzzle.